Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're wrestling with a really big philosophical question. Can religious belief ever truly be considered, rational? And maybe even more, can it actually count as knowledge?
Yeah, it's a huge one. It sits right at the heart of epistemology. That's the whole study of knowledge and, rationality itself.
Right.
We've been looking through some sources that lay out the main philosophical players and their takes on this. So our goal today is really to unpack these different views, see what light they shed.
And it's really important to stress, like the sources do right up front, this isn't about whether specific religious beliefs are true. That's a whole other deep dive.
Totally different question. You can absolutely hold a belief that's rational for you based on what you know, but still turn out to be mistaken.
Exactly. Like the sources use this analogy of two scientists, right?
Yeah, imagine they're looking at the same, maybe really complex data set.
Okay.
They might honestly come to opposite conclusions about what it all means. Now, maybe only one of them is actually right in the end. Sure. But both scientists could be acting completely rationally, based on how they're interpreting the evidence they have at that moment.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So rationality is more about your justification, your reasons, given where you're coming from.
Precisely. But knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge needs that extra ingredient, truth. You can't know something that's false.
Right. So if, say, you believe in God and I don't, only one of us, at most, could actually know they're right. But could both of our beliefs still be rational? That's the really tricky part we're getting into here, looking at these sources.
And the most natural place to start when we ask if any belief is rational is usually evidence, right? We tend to think a rational belief needs some good reasons, some solid support.
Okay, so if we start there, rationality needs evidence. What does that actually mean for religious belief? What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, that takes us straight to the first view, often called Evidentialism. The core idea is pretty straightforward. For a religious belief to count as rational, you just have to have appropriate evidential support for it. Simple as that, on the surface.
Appropriate evidence. Okay, so does something like, a really powerful personal religious experience count? Or reading a sacred text that feels deeply true?
Now that's where evidentialism, especially in its historical forms, like with John Locke, gets quite strict. They typically demand evidence that's independent of the religious belief itself.
Independent.
Meaning it has to be the kind of evidence that any rational person, whether they're religious or not, ought to recognize as good evidence, publicly accessible, you might say.
Okay. So things like my personal feeling or what my scripture says or even what other people in my faith tell me, those might feel convincing to me.
Right.
But they wouldn't pass this evidentialist test because they aren't universally available or convincing.
That's generally the worry, yeah. The concern is that those kinds of reasons might sort of presuppose the very thing they're trying to support.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the Bible is only considered good evidence if you already believe God exists and inspired it, then you can't really use the Bible as independent evidence to prove God exists in the first place. It's circular.
Right. Okay. I see the problem there. So if personal experience and scripture are out, what kind of evidence were traditional evidentialists looking for?
Often they were looking for purely rational philosophical proofs for God's existence. Things like the ontological argument, trying to prove God from the very concept of God.
Oh yeah, those abstract arguments.
Exactly. Or older versions of the cosmological argument, arguing from the fact that the universe exists back to some kind of necessary first cause, which they identify as God.
But, like our source material points out, most people today, even philosophers, don't really think those super abstract proofs actually work to make belief rational for the average person in the way evidentialism seems to demand. They feel a bit detached, or they rely on philosophical ideas not everyone accepts.
That's a very common view now, yes. However, the source does mention a slightly different kind of argument that maybe fits the evidentialist picture a bit better, the design argument.
The argument from design. Like looking at the complexity of nature.
Exactly. This one appeals to evidence we can actually see in the world, the apparent order, the complexity, the way the universe seems fine-tuned for life. And the argument is that this points towards an intelligent designer.
Okay, and that counts because it's based on observing the world around us, something anyone can do.
That's the idea. Proponents would say, look, this is public evidence, data from the world, and any rational person should take it seriously as evidence, even if they ultimately disagree about the conclusion, about whether it proves God.
It's trying to meet that independent, universally accessible standard.
Precisely. But as the source concludes, even with arguments like that, evidentialism generally sets a really high standard, kind of austere, the source calls it. And it's a standard that many common forms of religious belief might struggle to meet.
So it's a tough road if you're sticking strictly to that kind of independent universal evidence. What are the alternatives then? Where else do philosophers go?
Well, one major alternative just completely changes the game. It's called fideism. You often hear names like Søren Kierkegaard, maybe Ludwig Wittgenstein associated with this kind of thinking.
Okay.
And their claim is pretty radical. They basically say it's a fundamental mistake to even try evaluating religious belief using concepts like rationality or knowledge at all.
Wait, so it's not that religious belief is irrational, it's that those labels don't apply.
That's the core idea. They see religious belief as essentially irrational, neither rational nor irrational. It's just something else entirely.
Something else. Like what?
Like faith. They see religious conviction primarily as a matter of faith or maybe commitment, which is fundamentally different from the kind of belief you get by, say, weighing evidence in a scientific way.
And I guess from that perspective, you'd almost expect faith to hold firm, even if evidence seems to point the other way.
Absolutely. The fideists might say that's part of what faith is. So trying to judge faith by epistemic standards, the standards we use for knowledge and rational belief is like, I don't know, trying to measure friendship in meters. You're just using the wrong framework. You're misunderstanding its nature.
Wow, okay. That really is a complete shift in perspective. So if we don't go down the fideist route, are there views that try to bridge this, that say religious belief can be rational, but maybe not in the strict evidentialist way?
Yes, definitely. And that brings us to a really influential modern view called Reformed Epistemology. Alvin Plantinga is the big name here.
Okay, Plantinga.
And this view pushes back hard against both evidentialism's really high demands and fideism's claim that rationality just doesn't apply. Reformed epistemology argues that religious belief can be rational and it can even be knowledge.
Right.
And this is the key move. If we evaluate it using the same standards we naturally apply to our ordinary, everyday beliefs.
Okay, same standards as ordinary beliefs. Like, what's an example of an everyday belief we think is rational without needing loads of independent proof?
The classic example they always use is perceptual belief. You know, the beliefs you form just by seeing things, hearing things, touching things right now.
Like, I believe there's a desk in front of me because I see it and feel it.
Exactly. We almost all automatically accept beliefs like that as rational. And if there really is a desk there, we think you know it's there. It's a basic source of knowledge.
Yeah, okay. And you're right. I don't usually stop and try to gather independent proof that my eyes are working correctly right now. I just trust them.
Precisely. And that's the point Reformed epistemologists make. For most of our perceptual beliefs, we have very little, maybe zero, independent evidence that they're true or that our senses are reliable in that moment. Think about it. If you wanted to prove your eyes are working, what would you do? Maybe we'll look again or touch the object, but that still relies on your senses. It's not independent proof. And actually, many philosophers admit we don't really have a solid, independent, non-circular argument to prove our senses reliably connect us to reality.
But we still operate as if they do. We think seeing the desk makes the belief rational and usually gives us knowledge.
Exactly. We generally take perceptual beliefs to be rational and potentially knowledge provided our perceptual faculties, our eyes, ears, etc., are functioning properly in the right kind of environment.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. They're setting up an argument that evidentialism is being unfair, right?
Yeah.
Applying a much tougher standard to religious belief than we apply to something as basic as perception.
That's exactly it. They call it the double standard argument. If perceptual belief can be rational and yield knowledge without independent evidence, just by being the product of properly functioning cognitive faculties, then why can't the same be true for religious beliefs if they're also produced by some kind of properly functioning faculty?
Okay, but what faculty? We have eyes and ears for perception. What's a proposed faculty for religious belief?
Right. This is the positive part of their theory. They propose the existence of something called the sensus divinitatis.
Sensus divinitatis, Latin for?
Sense of the divine, basically. They conceptualize it as an innate human faculty, maybe like a capacity we're all born with, that when it's working correctly,
allows us to form basic religious beliefs.
Yeah.
Like a kind of built-in spiritual antenna.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. The claim is, just like properly functioning senses, in the right conditions, give you rational perceptual beliefs. There's a tree. A properly functioning sensus divinitatis, in the right conditions, can give you rational basic religious beliefs like God exists, or God created this beauty, or maybe God disapproves of what I just did.
But wait, here's where I always get a bit stuck with that analogy. Pretty much everyone agrees on what counts as seeing a tree, right? Our senses seem to work in Bradley similar ways, but religious beliefs are all over the map. Lots of people don't seem to have this sensus divinitatis switched on, or they have very different readings. Doesn't that difference break the analogy with perception?
That's a really important objection, and the source definitely covers it. The Reformed epistemologist's response is quite subtle. They say the crucial question isn't whether there are reasons for the belief that everyone else, including atheists or people of other faiths, would find convincing.
Okay.
The question is whether the belief is rational for the believer who holds it, given the way it was formed in them.
Okay. Like that example the source gives. Say you clearly see someone you trust implicitly, maybe your best friend, pocket something in a shop. You might rationally believe they stole it based purely on your sight, your properly functioning in perception.
Right.
Even if nobody else believes you, because, say, that friend has a perfect reputation. Your belief is rational for you, based on your senses working right, even if others reject your evidence, which is just your testimony about what you saw.
Exactly that. So the argument uses parity of reasoning. If a belief formed by your properly functioning senses can be rational for you, even when others won't accept your basis for it, then they argue a belief formed by a properly functioning sensus divinitatis can be rational from that believer, even if others don't have that faculty or don't recognize it.
So lacking universally agreed upon evidence isn't necessarily a deal breaker for individual rationality.
Yeah.
On this view.
That's the core claim. It really reframes what we mean by rational justification in this context.
Okay, that's a powerful alternative.
Yeah.
What comes next? Is there another way to think about this?
There is. The next perspective is called Quasi-Fideism. Now, this one shares a feature with Reformed epistemology. It also uses a kind of parity argument, comparing religious belief to ordinary beliefs.
Okay, another parity argument. But how does it differ?
It differs significantly in its conclusion about the nature of our most basic beliefs. Quasi-Fideism actually agrees more with fideism on one key point. It claims that many of our most fundamental rock-bottom convictions, and this is crucial, both religious and everyday ones, are essentially irrational.
Whoa, wait, irrational, like fideism said, but applying to everyday beliefs too.
Exactly. They argue that if you dig down deep enough in any belief system, religious or just your regular beliefs about the world, you eventually hit foundational commitments that aren't themselves based on evidence or reasons. They're more like fundamental assumptions, or you could say a kind of basic faith.
So not just belief in God being maybe irrational at its core, but maybe even believing the external world is real, or that my memory is generally reliable, those basic things.
That's the kind of thing you're suggesting, yes. Whereas Reformed epistemology sees basic perceptual belief as rational in itself, produced by a reliable faculty, quasi-fideism suggests that the ultimate foundations of all our thinking, religious or mundane, rest on these commitments that aren't in themselves rational or irrational. They just are the starting points.
Okay, but if the very foundations are irrational, doesn't that make everything built on top of them kind of shaky? Doesn't it make all our non-basic beliefs ultimately non-rational too?
This is where their specific parity argument kicks in. They say no, it doesn't automatically make the non-basic beliefs irrational, and here's why. They argue that because this situation applies to all belief systems, everyone's beliefs ultimately rest on some irrational foundations, we can still compare them.
Okay. How does the comparison work?
They say, look, we generally consider everyday non-basic beliefs to be capable of being rational, right? Like my belief that my car is parked outside is rational because I remember parking it there, even though that rests on trusting my memory, maybe trusting perception, which might have a rational foundation.
Right, we usually call that a rational belief.
So the quasi-fideist argues, if those everyday non-basic beliefs can be rational despite resting on irrational foundations, then by parity, non-basic religious beliefs, like maybe I should pray for guidance on this decision, which rests on a basic, perhaps irrational belief in God who hears prayer, can also be rational.
I think I'm getting it. The parity isn't saying religious belief is just like perception. It's saying the foundational structure of religious belief systems isn't uniquely problematic because all belief systems have similar irrational foundations, and yet we still consider non-basic beliefs in other areas rational.
Exactly. It provides a different kind of parity. It avoids the evidentialist challenge, not by claiming religious belief meets the evidence standard, nor by claiming a special faculty like Reformed epistemology, but by arguing that the supposed problem at the foundation, lack of evidential support for basic beliefs is actually universal.
So it differs from classic fideism because fideism says all religious belief is irrational, whereas this says only the basic ones are, and that's true for all types of basic beliefs.
Precisely. It limits the irrationality claim to the foundational level and extends it universally, thus aiming to put religious belief on an equal footing with other forms of belief regarding its ultimate grounding.
That is a really interesting way to frame it, focusing on the very bedrock of belief itself. Okay, is there one more perspective in the mix from our sources?
Yes. One final approach discussed is the exemplar account. This one suggests we might be using the wrong comparison point altogether. Maybe religious belief isn't best compared to perception or even just basic logical reasoning. Maybe it's more like ethics or even aesthetics, judgments about beauty.
Ethics, like beliefs about what's right and wrong, good and bad. How is religious belief supposed to be like that?
Well, proponents of this view point to certain features they think ethics and religious belief share, features that are maybe less prominent in simple perception.
Like what?
Well, think about ethics. First, you don't just instantly become ethically wise, right? Acquiring ethical understanding, moral sensitivity. It usually takes time, experience, learning, reflection. It's a kind of expertise you develop.
Yeah, that seems true. You learn over time.
Second, specific kinds of experiences seem really important for developing that ethical sense. You know, actually facing moral dilemmas, seeing the consequences of actions, reflecting on complex situations. And third, they emphasize the role of ethical exemplars, people we look up to, as morally wise or virtuous. We learn a lot about ethics by observing them, hearing their insights, trying to emulate their character.
Okay, yeah, I can see the parallels they're drawing. Developing religious faith or understanding often involves a long journey, maybe key spiritual experiences, and definitely learning from figures considered holy or wise, saints, prophets, mentors.
Exactly. So the exemplar account claims that rational religious belief and maybe even religious knowledge isn't acquired passively, like just opening your eyes,
Right.
as in the perception model. It's acquired more actively through specific kinds of experiences by cultivating a certain sensitivity or expertise over time, and very importantly, by learning from and engaging with religious exemplars who embody and transmit that wisdom.
That does sound like a plausible description of how religious understanding often develops for people. But the source mentions a potential catch with this analogy too, doesn't it?
It does. The potential weakness is this. While we generally take perception as a fairly reliable source of knowledge about the physical world, there's actually much less agreement among philosophers about whether ethics or aesthetics really delivers objective knowledge.
Like, are there actual moral facts out there that our ethical sense tunes into? Or is it more subjective or culturally relative?
Right. That's a huge debate in ethics itself. And if the status of ethical belief as genuine knowledge or undisputed rationality is shaky, then using ethics as the model for religious belief might just import those same kinds of questions and uncertainties. Can you really ground the rationality of religious belief by comparing it to another domain whose own rational standing is heavily debated?
So the strength of this whole exemplar account kind of depends on how confident we are about the epistemic status of ethics itself. If ethics isn't a clear case of knowledge, the analogy might not help religious belief as much.
That's the potential issue, yes.
Yeah.
It ties the fate of understanding religious rationality to how we understand ethical rationality.
Wow. Okay, we've definitely covered a lot of philosophical ground here. Just to maybe zoom out for a second and recap the main positions we walked through based on the sources.
Sure.
We started with Evidentialism, which demands that rational religious belief needs independent evidence, the kind any rational person should accept. Pretty high bar.
Strict standard.
Then we had Fideism, doing a complete 180, saying rationality is just the wrong category. Religious belief is irrational, a matter of faith, not evidence.
Outside the game entirely.
Then Reformed Epistemology, arguing religious belief can be rational, just like perception, if it comes from a properly working innate faculty, the sensus divinitatis. Rational for the believer, even without universal proof.
The parity with perception move.
Next was Quasi-Fideism, also using parity, but arguing that all belief systems, religious or not, rest on irrational basic commitments. So non-basic religious beliefs can be rational, just like non-basic everyday beliefs can, despite those foundations.
The universal irrational foundation parity.
And finally, the exemplar account, suggesting we compare religious belief not to perception, but to ethics. emphasizing the role of experience, developing expertise, and learning from wise exemplars.
Right, the developmental wisdom tradition model.
That really lays out the different ways philosophers, according to our sources, have tried to tackle this. It's fascinating to see the different analogies they reach for perception, ethics, or the different concepts they introduce, like this sensus divinitatis, or these ideas about irrational commitments.
It absolutely shows how the answer you get depends hugely on the framework you start with. What counts as a good reason? What are our baseline rational beliefs? How do different domains of belief work? These are the underlying questions.
Which leads us perfectly to the final thought the source material at least is hanging with, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. Given all these different accounts we've discussed, some demanding evidence that everyone has to accept, others appealing to internal faculties or basic commitments that maybe aren't universally shared or even seen as rational by everyone, does it fundamentally matter for a belief to be rational, whether its basis can be recognized or accepted by everyone?
Sure.
Or is it enough for rationality that the basis is adequate for the person holding the belief from their own perspective and cognitive situation?
It really cuts to the core of what we mean by justification, doesn't it? Is it purely internal to the believer, or does it need some kind of external validation or universal accessibility?
A really fundamental question to ponder. Well, thank you for joining us on this pretty deep dive into the philosophy of religious belief and rationality.
It was great digging into these ideas. Lots to think about.
We certainly hope we've given you a clearer map of this complex and often quite personal philosophical landscape. Until next time on The Deep Dive.